Hello and welcome to Analytics Nexus 2019, the premier virtual event for analytics best practice. This presentation is titled How to Unlock the Power of Analytics Through Data Enrichment and will be presented by Adam Greco. This is just one webinar and a whole series of presentations you have access to beginning today. A few quick housekeeping items before I introduce this particular presentation. At any time, you can interact with this presenter or other presenters with questions and/or comments on Slack. The Slack address for Analytics Nexus is analyticsnexus.slack.com, and you should have received an email invitation to join if you registered in advance. If you didn't receive that email, you can find an invitation link to the Slack in the menu below, as well as in the resource list. Once you log into the Analytics Nexus Slack, you can find the channel for Adam Greco to engage. Also, you can engage with us on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @analytics_nexus. Finally, for questions on Analytics Nexus or Claravine, which is producing this event, feel free to email us at info@claravine.com. This session will be presented by Adam Greco. Adam is a senior partner at Analytics Demystified and has consulted with hundreds of clients across every industry vertical. He is also a formal advisor to Claravine. Adam, over to you.
Thanks, Tyler. Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Greco, and I am a senior partner with Analytics Demystified. A little background on me for those of you who I haven't met. I managed the analytics implementation at the CME Group and Salesforce.com. And I was one of the early employees at Omniture, where I got a chance to work on many analytics implementations, both in the US and abroad. And I worked with Adobe to help write the book on Adobe Analytics. So I'm excited to be part of Claravine's Analytics Nexus event. Today I wanted to spend a little time talking about data enrichment. In the analytics industry, there's tons of ways that you can enrich data that you collect via JavaScript. Unfortunately, however, I've seen many organizations that fail to take true advantage of the powers that their analytics tool provides in the area of data enrichment. So today I want to walk through some of the most common use cases that I see people enriching data, and then go through some more advanced ones that I've done with past clients. So let's start by talking about why you might want to enrich data in your analytics tool. There's a bunch of different reasons, and it depends on which tools you're using and your specific situation. But here are some of the main reasons why people choose to enrich data. First of all, some analytics tools may not provide enough dimensions for you to capture all of the data that you might want to capture at the time of data collection. Second, there may be some data that just isn't available at the time that you're loading the page and you're collecting data, or it may not be able to be exposed to your data layer in real time. Another reason might be that you want to have a level of flexibility to be able to modify and update the data over time, which often isn't the case if you pass data directly into your analytics tool. And fourth, there may be some data that you want to collect, but you don't actually want to show your visitors that you are collecting that data, since anything collected in JavaScript can be easily seen in JavaScript debuggers. So let's go through some of these reasons that I just outlined in a little more detail. First one I mentioned was that your product or analytics tool may not have enough dimensions. Now, when it comes to enriching data, as I mentioned, you're adding data to data you already have. A common term for that we use is metadata. Now, there are cases where you could have enough dimensions, but it would be silly for you to actually waste 10 or 15 dimensions on something that you could actually store in just one dimension and then add metadata, which doesn't count against your finite number of dimensions that your analytics vendor may give you. In this case, we're looking at Adobe Analytics, and by the way, I'll probably be referencing Adobe in most of my slides since that's the world I live in, but most of the things I'll be talking about today work regardless of whether you're using Adobe Analytics, Google Analytics, or anything else. But in this case, if this customer only has 100 EBARs, then they might get nervous that they're going to run out of EVARs in their implementation. So they might look at data enrichment as a way to really make sure that they're taking advantage of the finite number of variables or dimensions that they do have. Now, the second reason I mentioned why people might enrich data is if data isn't available at the time of collection. Now, an example of this is if you're using external marketing campaigns. Now, you may have a campaign that you want to run and everyone's in a hurry to get it out there, but you may not know all of the data around that campaign. You may not know exactly which brand it's related to. You might not know who the owner is or the exact friendly name that you want to call that campaign. It would be a shame if you actually held up the launch of the campaign until you got all of the data that you need to be able to capture that in real time in dimensions when the campaign launches. So using data enrichment, you can actually launch the campaign and just capture the detailed little campaign code, and that's really just kind of your primary key for your campaign, knowing that you could always use data enrichment later to add any metadata or any other data that you want related to the campaign after the fact. The next case I mentioned was wanting to have flexibility to change your data over time. As many of you probably know, if you capture data through JavaScript into a dimension in your analytics tool, that information is locked there forever. If you use data enrichment, however, you can actually change the data over time. So for example, let's say that you have a particular product that you capture in JavaScript, but that product today is in category A. So you might want to roll that up and add metadata that says this product is in category A. But in following months, if that product actually moves to category B, then you're in trouble because you've kind of locked it in to category A. Now that's fine if you want to actually document which category it was in at the time, but many companies want to have the flexibility to say, we're going to make some wholesale changes in our products or our campaigns, and we want to be able to re-upload the metadata that's around those products and have those products move accordingly to that new area. And data enrichment is a way that provides that flexibility to change that whenever you need to. Lastly, one of the reasons you might want to use data enrichment is to collect data but not necessarily have your users see everything that you're collecting about them. So I don't want this to sound too nefarious, and you want to make sure that you're adhering to your legal policies, GDPR, and all of that. But there may be some cases where you don't want the prying eyes of JavaScript debuggers or cool tools like Charles showing your users everything that you're doing about them. For example, here I'm showing where there's a company that's actually capturing email address in a dimension. That's bad. You never really want to do that. But if you absolutely had to have email address associated with a particular user, you could upload that as metadata or enrich your ID. In this case, I'm using a CRM ID. And then you would still have the email address, but you don't have to show all your users are capturing it. Again, keeping in mind all of your policies and GDPR. But another one that you could think about is maybe customer segment. So let's say that you take all of your visitors and put them into a particular segment based on your data warehouse. You probably, even if you could get that data in real time, you probably don't want to show your users that they're in segment A or segment B, even if you, especially if you have funny names for those segments and you don't want them to see those. So one of the last reasons why people use data enrichment is to add all of this extra metadata to their visitors without having to advertise all of the things that you're tracking about them. So I just covered some of the reasons why you would want to enrich data, but let's take a step back and really make sure we're on the same page with what data enrichment is. Now, each analytics tool has a different name for data enrichment, which is why it can be a little confusing. Just for reference, before we dig into the what enrichment is, if you have Adobe Analytics, I'm really going to be talking about Saint classifications. If you have Google Analytics, I'm going to be talking about dimension widening. Other tools like Snowplow Analytics, they just actually call it data enrichment. So depending on which tool you use, the name of data enrichment, the feature, might be a teeny bit different. But regardless of what your tool calls it, at the end of the day, as I mentioned earlier, data enrichment is the process of adding additional data to the data that you've already collected, normally via JavaScript, and that's often called metadata. Now, metadata can be added to your analytics tool in a number of ways. You can just upload it in a browser. You can FTP the metadata in. You can use APIs. Or you could use third-party tools like Claravine and basically upload the data automatically using a table that they provide. But ultimately, usually this metadata does not go in via JavaScript tags, and it's up to you to decide how often and when you're going to add this metadata to it. And more importantly, you have to look at your dimensions that are part of your implementation and determine, is there any additional data that I can provide to this dimension that would help me to do more analysis and help my users to better understand what's happening on my website or my mobile app. Now, one of the cool uses of data enrichment is that it actually allows you to aggregate your data in your analytics tool similar to a way that you would use a pivot table in Microsoft Excel. And this is one of the features I just love about metadata. So in the screen I'm showing here, you could see that I have a number of blog posts, and then I have decided to enrich the name of the blog post with a metadata attribute that I'm calling blog post type. So what I can do is I can look at each of my blog posts and determine what blog post type do I want to aggregate this into, just like I would do with an Excel pivot table. Now, once I've uploaded this metadata, you'll see in the screenshot on the right that I can then go into my analytics tool, and I can now see all of my blog posts grouped by the type. And so this is just an easy way that you can group things together and start to sum up your metrics and see how they're performing over time without having to know the type of blog post, in this case, at the time that the page was loaded. Now, once you've created your metadata attributes and you've actually uploaded the data that you need for it, these attributes can often be used just like any other data point that you have in your implementation. So here I'm looking at an example of a campaign tracking code where I have added a metadata attribute of source. This allows me to drag over source and look at any metric that I want. In this case, I'm looking at blog post views by that attribute, just like I could for the actual tracking code upon which the source is based. So if you add 20 or 30 metadata attributes to your analytics implementation, you're just opening up the capability of having 20 or 30 more reports that you can view and slice your data by. What's even cooler about this is that you can also use any metadata attribute for segmentation. So hopefully most of you know this, but segmentation is the ability in an analytics tool to basically narrow down the data you're looking at for a particular group of people or segment. Now what's amazing is when you add metadata to your attributes, not only can you segment on the root thing that you captured in JavaScript, but you could segment on the metadata itself. Now here's an example that I use on my website. I use a third-party product called Demandbase to see if I can figure out what companies are actually coming to my website, reading my blog posts. Now when I do analysis, there are some companies I really don't want to focus on. I have a number of companies that provide similar services to me, so I've actually created a segment that is based on a metadata attribute called competitor flag. So what I do is if I see a competitor who's routinely reading my blog posts, I will then mark them as a competitor in the metadata attribute, upload that, and then build a segment that is saying, basically, when I'm doing analysis today, I want to look at people who viewed an Atom blog post, but I really want to exclude those competitors because I doubt that they're going to want to buy my consulting services. Now, before we get into the use cases that I really want to spend the majority of the time on, there is one data enrichment or metadata question that I get over and over again that I wanted to just address really quickly. The question I get is, how do I know whether I should pass a data point into a particular dimension directly via JavaScript, or when should I use it as a metadata attribute and enrich the data? So this can be tricky, and it kind of has to be solved on a case-by-case basis. But at a high level, my rule of thumb is that if there's a data point that I want to lock in forever, then I tend to pass it directly into a dimension in my analytics tool. So for example, I might want to capture city or age, because if I capture, say, a user ID and then I upload their city or upload their age, the problem is that as I upload that year after year, if someone moves cities, then it's going to look like all of their web behavior took place in the city they moved to, not the city they were in when they took the action. And in a similar way, people tend to age over time. So if someone has a birthday, we might look at people who did activities on our website when they were 40 years old, but actually they could have been 38 or 39 when they did those activities, but our attribute that we uploaded, the data enrichment, overwrote the old data. But conversely, there's some cases where you actually want the ability to modify that data. So for example, if you capture a campaign code and then you upload the metadata that says, hey, these campaign codes are paid search and these other ones are display ads, but maybe you made a mistake on a bunch of campaign codes. Well, if you upload that as metadata, you can make changes to the particular codes, re-upload the metadata, and then everything will be fixed. However, if you would have passed that in directly, the marketing channel in this case, directly to a dimension and made a mistake, it would be much more difficult to change that data after the fact. So those are just kind of my rules of thumb for when you should pass data in directly and what to think about when you want to think about enriching data instead. Okay, so enough with the setup. We've talked about why you might want to enrich data. We've talked about what data enrichment is. Now let's actually get into some real-world use cases of when you can use data enrichment. And I'm going to start with the most popular ones that I see across all of the analytics implementations that I do. Now by far, external campaigns is the most popular use of data enrichment in the analytics space. This is where most of my clients first learn what data enrichment is and how it can be really powerful. So as I mentioned earlier, you typically have external marketing campaigns where you have paid search keywords, you might have display ads, and you associate a campaign code so that when people click on any of those ads, they basically come to your website. Normally that code is captured in a query string and then passed into a dimension. But those codes represent just a placeholder of all of the information that you want to track about that campaign. Typical things that people want to enrich that with is the marketing channel, is it SEO, paid search, email, the source, the owner. You might even want to document what type of ad it was. Was it a text link? Was it an image? If you're doing display ads, you might want to kind of think about the placement. Was it on the right side of a website page? Was it a really big hero spot? Was it a small spot? But all of these attributes are ones that can be added after the fact to the unique ID. So normally you have to figure out what are the attributes that your campaign team wants, and basically how do you tie those attributes to the codes, and then eventually you can upload all of the metadata, which will then be retroactively added in all of the campaign reports. Now one example of this is using the UTM standard that was made popular by Google Analytics and AdWords. So in this example, I'm actually taking my campaign tracking code and then classifying it with things like source, medium, description, and owner. And so there's lots of different ways to do this. What I tend to do is actually concatenate all of those values into my campaign tracking code when they arrive to the site in the campaign variable via JavaScript. And then here I'm showing using the Adobe Analytics Classification Rule Builder, where I've set up a set of regex rules that will actually split out the source, medium, description, and owner into different metadata attributes, so I can open up all of these different reports and I can segment on all of these different reports. So if I were to open up the medium report, then it would basically be an aggregation of all of my campaign codes grouped by medium. So this has become really popular, and I actually have a blog post that goes through how to do this, and it's probably the most viewed blog post of all of the ones that I've ever created because the UTM standard has become so popular. Now, the next most popular data enrichment use case that I've seen for analytics is around the product. So most organizations have a product that they sell. Even if you're a B2B company, like when I worked at Salesforce.com, we didn't sell anything directly on the website, but we still wanted to have a product dimension so we could see how often people were looking at our different products like Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, Chatter, and so on. So if you have products, then you're going to capture some sort of an ID or name for that product in a dimension in your analytics tool. But as you can imagine, you might have a whole table, a whole database of attributes for each product. You might want to have a friendly name for the product. As I mentioned earlier, you might want to have the category or subcategory. You might even group products into different business units or divisions, and you might have owners for each of the products. I've had some clients that have had up to 50 or 60 attributes for their products. So any of these attributes can be added as metadata and then uploaded after the fact while you're still only capturing a particular product ID in JavaScript. In addition, there may be some really specific items that you want to add as metadata to your products. For example, if you're a retailer, you might have things like color or size. If you're a retailer that has products that span multiple brands or manufacturers, you might want to capture that as an attribute so that you can group all of your product views, cart ads, orders, and revenue by brand or manufacturer. And here's just an example of some of the attributes that I've seen people use when it comes to their product ID. Lastly, when it comes to products, there are some retailers that have some really complex structures between products and SKUs. So another use case for data enrichment might be to actually add metadata to both products and SKUs. In this case, I have a client that's storing stuff at the SKU level, and they want to actually roll up SKUs into products because they have so many different permutations of each product. But regardless whether you're adding metadata to the product itself or the SKU, it serves the purpose of being able to group things, add more metadata that you can do segmentation on, and slice and dice your data in different reports in your analytics tool. Another common use case for data enrichment is internal campaigns. Now, internal campaigns are basically those promotions or banners that you put on the website that you're trying to get people to click on to steer them in the right direction, maybe highlight a particular product that you're trying to push at the time. So here I'm showing an example of my old employer, Salesforce.com, where you could see I've highlighted in red a bunch of different internal campaigns or promos that they might want to track in JavaScript with an ID, but that later they might want to add metadata for. Now, the type of metadata that people want to track related to internal campaigns can differ from company to company, but the ones that I've seen most often used are related to what is the creative that was behind this particular click on an internal campaign. And if we have a bunch of different creatives, maybe there's a different version. So maybe you're testing out some different colors and so on. You might also want to document where was this particular click. Was it in the hero spot? Was it in a sub-hero spot? Was it in the left nav, right nav? So really the placement and the location. You might want to also document the size. Is this a really big thing that you showed them, or was it just a little link that was off to the side? Speaking of which, you might want to capture the type of internal campaign it is. You might have a button. You might have an image. You might just have text links. And then there may be different reasons why that internal campaign showed up. Maybe you put it there because you're trying to cross-sell something. Maybe you took over a portion of the web page using Optimizely or Adobe Target because you want to do an A/B test, and that's the reason it showed up there. Or maybe you're even using a product like Certona or something that is using algorithms to figure out which internal promos should show where. But on the right here, I'm showing that regardless of what you want to track, you can take your internal campaign dimension and then choose what are the attributes that you want to upload, and that will allow you to group things however you want and slice and dice your data accordingly. Email is another venue in which you might want to add metadata to your implementation. Typically, when you send an email to your users or prospects, they will click on one of the links within the email, come back to your website, and they'll come in with a message ID, which is usually a number that identifies which email it was that they clicked. You might also potentially have an identifier for what was the link or portion within the email that they clicked. But this is something that is captured in JavaScript in a dimension that can later be augmented with metadata. So as an example, here I'm showing a report in Adobe Analytics where we're looking at visits, cart ads, orders, and revenue by email ID. Now, there's a huge portion of the website visit and all of our successes that actually have nothing to do with emails. But when we see these specific email IDs, this may not mean that much to us. We just see that we have email 529, 531, and so on. So this isn't going to really help our users that much until we can add metadata to make their lives a little easier. Closing out this example, you can see here that I've now taken my email ID dimension, and I've decided that I want to see it by campaign, by what was the delivery tool, the name of the email, the owner, the objective, and if I can identify the particular type of link that they clicked on, I want to document that as well. So that link could have been, a button, the main call to action in the email. Maybe I have a different identifier for whether they clicked in the header or the footer. But as you can see, all of these attributes are ones that make it easier for your users to understand the success of emails, and they can slice and dice anytime they want. For example, if they want to look at all emails that are being sent out by a particular owner, they can see if the conversion rate from that owner is better than a different owner. So again, just an easy example to figure out how you can take an email campaign and offer your users different ways to see the data using data enrichment. So external campaigns, products, internal campaigns, emails, those are kind of the typical use cases. So next I want to get into a little more advanced use cases that I've worked with clients to do to really push data enrichment to the next level. So I'm going to start with one of my favorite examples. I call this the logged in user ID or website ID example. Now, many websites have a facility where users can create an account, and then they can optionally choose to log in, and there's usually some benefits for them if they log in. Here I'm showing a company, Waters Corporation, where you can see that as I log into their website, they're actually storing in a dimension a Waters web ID. Now, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just a numeric value that they store on the back end. Unfortunately, what I have seen over and over and over again is that even if companies are doing a good job by capturing some sort of a user or web ID, just like shown in the report here, they actually don't take it the step further that they should and upload any attributes or metadata that they have about those user IDs. If you think about it, most companies nowadays have CRM systems. They also have data lakes. They have data warehouses. And the odds are that if you know who a person is and you've captured their information, you probably somewhere in your organization have tons of information about them that could be really beneficial to your digital analysts if we could find a way to get that into the analytics implementation. More opportunities for them to break down reports by different attributes or build really deep and rich segments off of that data using the web or logged in user ID as the primary key. So what might some of these attributes be? So I'm going to go through this in detail because I think this is really, really powerful. If you imagine in the digital analytics space, we tend to focus a lot on cookies. We use cookies to basically capture a lot of information. But we all realize that people delete cookies, people change browsers, and so on. So we can't be 100% reliant on cookies. But let's imagine that you would like to take the user ID and you'd like to understand for each user things like how long have they been a user, like when did they create their account. I want to know how many times have they been to the website lifetime. Now, you can try to see that in your digital analytics tool, but it's going to be wrong because they're going to delete cookies. But if you actually know every time they log in and you pass that to your data warehouse, then you actually on the back end have a more realistic number of how many times they've been to the website. Similarly, original campaign source. How did you first find this particular person? Well, again, if you look in your analytics tool, that's probably long gone. They've probably changed computers or browsers or deleted cookies since then. So even if you were to use a first touch campaign attribute, it's wrong. You might want to look at how long it's been since they've been to the website last, which most analytics tools will try to provide, but again, that's dependent on cookies. And you might want to look at the lifetime number of products that they've viewed on the website. That is going to be much more accurate from your data warehouse. Most importantly, you might want to take their user ID and actually combine that with your CRM system by saying, you know what, on the back end, we actually have a different ID for this customer. It's very rare that your website ID is going to be the same as your actual data warehouse or CRM ID. So one of the things that you can do is make a connection between the website ID and the CRM ID. And now you've got two different primary keys, and that can open up a whole world of possibilities. But the general gist here that I want to show you is that by adding these attributes to the user ID and then deciding can we pull this from our back end, you might get much more accurate information that can be used for your reports and segmentation than you would if you're solely reliant upon cookies. So as I mentioned, grabbing that CRM ID can really open up a whole new world of possibilities when it comes to analytics. So I want to dive into that a little bit more. So building upon what I just said, let's now imagine that we have captured the CRM, the web ID, and we have uploaded the CRM ID as a metadata attribute to the web ID. Well, now we can then go into our data warehouse and say, what attributes do we have about the CRM ID that we can then upload? So you see that I'm basically using the transitive theory to say if I have a web ID that I can map to a CRM ID, what could I pull in from the CRM ID? So here I'm showing an example where I could pull in things like customer lifetime value. Your back-end CRM system probably knows how much they've spent lifetime, so let's upload that as well. Customer segment. You might have some really complex customer segments that you do in Adobe or Google Analytics, but you might actually have some even more deep segments that encompass their online and offline behavior that's in your data warehouse. So if you can bring that forward, now you can do analysis on your website based on a segment that is an offline segment or a combined online-offline segment. You might be able to pull things like birth year, gender, country, city, how many kids they have, so on. All of these attributes are things you probably have in the CRM system. Now, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, you got to be cognizant of your legal policies, your GDPR stuff. But there's a massive amount of information that is just waiting to be pulled into your analytics tool. Imagine being able to build a segment based on how old someone is, how much they've spent lifetime, and then maybe include or exclude some of your data warehouse segments. That is super powerful for your digital analytics users, your analysts, to be able to really take the analysis to the next level. Now I know you're saying to yourself, Adam, that sounds cool, but that seems like it would be really complex. But believe it or not, it's not that difficult to do. You can download all of the data that you have from your CRM system or your data warehouse and just upload it into your analytics tool by CRM ID. Now, if you want to automate that process, you can do that through FTP and so on, or giving a little shout out and plug to our host here, Claravine, you could actually use a tool like Claravine to be able to build automated integration with your CRM tool. Here's an example of basically grabbing data in Salesforce.com and uploading it automatically to Adobe Analytics. So don't let the technology scare you or stop you. You really have to work with your users to figure out, do you need this data? And if we got you this data, would it improve your ability to improve the conversion rate on our website or get more leads, whatever it is that is your KPI? If that's the case, then I would find a way to do it and get your back-end data as metadata into your analytics tool. So the next use case I want to talk about isn't one that's as popular, but it can do some really cool things, and I call it order ID data enrichment. So let's imagine that you sell things on your website or in your app. The odds are that you have a unique order ID associated with every order confirmation. That is normally stored in a dimension in your analytics tool. However, that order is not static. Your order is going to change over time. It's going to move from processed to shipped. Maybe even some orders are returned, or someone has submitted an order but it's back ordered, so they're not going to get it right away. So you can actually use a data enrichment metadata attribute to populate the current status of it, so then your users can go in and break down their data by, I want to see all the products that have been shipped or returned, and so on. Now, another thing that happens with many of my retailers is they have an online order ID, but that order ID might be a little bit different from what's on their back end. Maybe in their data warehouse, that actually corresponds to a totally different order ID. And if that's the case, you might have different attributes from your data warehouse related to that order ID that you want to upload just to kind of keep things in sync. But one way or another, updating the status of an order is really easy to do with metadata. In a similar way, the last scenario I want to go through with you today is lead ID data enrichment. So unlike a retailer, if you're a B2B site, you might spend a lot of your time trying to get people to fill out lead forms. Now, when they fill out a lead form, you're likely going to have a unique ID that's associated with that submission. Now, just like an order I mentioned a second ago, you might have a different status over time for each of those leads. They might start as, maybe they're marketing qualified, but then they've been sales qualified. Maybe they were then later won or lost, and so on. So one of the cool things you can do is you can integrate with your CRM or your marketing automation system and upload the status of that lead and tie it to the unique lead ID. Later, if they end up purchasing products, you could even document which products they ultimately purchase, because maybe they started as a lead for product A, but they ultimately bought product A and product B. That could be some really good information in your analytics tool. And then lastly, if you do have a data warehouse, like I mentioned, where that lead ID actually has a bunch of different attributes, maybe you later find out what country they're in, what city they're in, their company size. And this is stuff that you probably didn't know when they first filled out the form, but maybe in your data warehouse or your CRM system, you got these attributes. You can then upload that, so then when you're looking at, say, your marketing campaigns, you could see, ooh, that's interesting. I didn't know that this particular Google keyword led to people that come from companies that have greater than 1,000 employees. So lots of cool ways you can kind of integrate your data there and enrich it so you could do better analysis. Okay, so there you have it. So just to summarize, what we've talked about today is that when you look at your analytics implementation, the first thing that I recommend that you do is look at all of the data that's being collected, typically through JavaScript, and determine, are there any other attributes that I could add to my implementation through data enrichment that would help me to do better segments, better analysis, and so on. You can also use data enrichment to just aggregate your data. If I want to group things, like look at all my campaign codes grouped by marketing channel, look at all my blog posts grouped by type, that could be another use case where maybe you're not even adding that much data, but you're just using data enrichment as a way to group things together. But when you add new metadata to your implementation, keep in mind that everything you add gives you more reports that you can look into, more ways that you could break down one thing by another. And as I've mentioned numerous times, segmentation is such a powerful part of digital analytics. And sometimes you want to make really granular segments. And so the more data points and more attributes that you have in your toolkit that you can use to build a segment, the more powerful your segments can be. And lastly, in the advanced portion, we talked about a lot of different ways that you can put a placeholder or a primary key in your digital analytics tool in a dimension, and then tap into all of your different disparate data sources, whether that's your data warehouse or your email tool or your CRM tool, to be able to get lots more data attributes in there so that you can do better analysis, better segmentation, and so on. Don't just think of data enrichment as a way to augment your data or group it. You also want to think of this as a way to extend it by using it just as a primary key to reach out into all the other systems you have at your organization to pull data in to make your analysis more powerful. So that's it for me. I hope this was helpful in just getting a primer on the way you should think about data enrichment and some of the cool use cases that you could use in your implementation, regardless of what analytics tool you use. My contact information is here if you have any follow-up questions. And with that, I will hand it back. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Adam, for presenting this material. It's been great to learn more about data enrichment. Just a reminder to our guests, you can engage with Adam with questions and or comments at his Slack channel on Analytics Nexus Slack. Thanks again.